Well, welcome everyone. Those joining us online, welcome. Welcome to people in the room. My name is Anna Petherick. I'm Associate Professor of Public Policy, and I study, among other things, gender and corruption. The title of this session is Navigating Transparency, Inclusion and Integrity, and the broad topic is procurement. You've had a long day, those who did EPLP especially, and it's a super hot day. So thank you, a big thank you for coming. And it's lovely to see some of my students here as well. So the purpose of talking about procurement, well, it's fairly obvious if you look at the numbers. I don't think we talk about it enough. About a third of government spending worldwide goes on procurement. That's about $13 trillion annually. And this means it's really important to dig into questions of efficiency and effectiveness, as well as doing public policy through procurement, such as trying to build inclusion in the market, but also do other forms of public policy as well. Now, if we're talking about effectiveness and efficiency, then there's huge advantages to doing procurement well. It is how, when governments outsource, they benefit from all the innovations in the private sector. But obviously, there's huge problems. And the one that comes to mind, and the one that brought some of this group together, is the problem of corruption, which, depending on your estimates, sucks up about 8 to 25% by value of procurement around the world in the form of bribes. And Chris and I were in Lithuania last week at Transparency International's big anti-corruption event, and we were observing the tendency to talk about corruption only in efficiency terms. And it's much more than that. It really affects trust in government. You think how many people at home round the dinner table notice the holes in the road. And they had put it together in a hazy way, often helped by really good journalists, and understanding that the problem is somewhere in elites and government and business. And that really erodes trust in government. And that contributes to so much else, from brain drains to so many other impacts, fake medicines, it goes on and on. I am hugely excited to welcome these panelists. We all, I think, well, most of us knew each other in some way before. So Lloydette, I met the Chandler sessions. Lloydette Bai-Marrow, did I get that correct?
Spot on.
Excellent. So the Chandler sessions, we should say, are a way of bringing together national heads of anti-corruption agencies and academics to talk about the interface of practice and policy, of practice and academia. And Lloydette was talking about electoral finance, which is a sticky subject.
I won't be mentioning anything about that today.
Okay.
I promise you.
But you're broadly, I would say, an amazing anti-corruption expert and economic crime experts. And you're the founding partner of Parametric Global Consulting. And next to me, I have an expert in procurement, Sope Williams, who's professor and head of department of mercantile law at Stellenbosch University. And you've done deep case analysis of many countries' procurement systems. You've studied procurement for a very long time, and you know everything.
I don't know if I know everything, but I have been researching for 25 years, so I think it's a long time.
And online, we have, last but not least, and I apologize for the gender balance of the panel, Mihaly Fazekas, who is Associate Professor at the Central European University and Scientific Director of the Government Transparency Institute. There is no paper on data analytics in procurement that doesn't have Mihaly's name on it. He's really revolutionized the field. There is, I would say, the same, as I said to Sope for Mihaly, there's nothing he doesn't know about this topic. So having said that and introduced the expertise of the panel, I do want to acknowledge the practical expertise in the room. And I want to invite you to share that and to share examples and to share best practice tips and insights. So that's plenty from me. I'm going to ask the panel one by one to say a little bit more about their area, but also some takeaway tips for practitioners from what they know in procurement. And once we've got lots of food for thought on the table, we'll embark on a discussion where I hope to bring in as many of your questions and ideas as possible. Sope, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure, why not? Good afternoon, everyone. So as I said, my name is Sope Williams, and I work in Stellenbosch University in South Africa, but I am from Nigeria. I've been working in Stellenbosch for 8 years now. I see there's another Nigerian here. Okay, so my background is in law. And I did, when I used to, in a past life, I taught at Nottingham University, and I did a PhD in public procurement and anti-corruption law, which is where my interest came from. But my connection to anti-corruption, if I can say that, really came from my family background, because at the time when I was starting out as an academic in Nottingham, my mom had just been promoted to be in charge of defense contracts in Nigeria. Right. And so all her stories were about like really shady, And so when it was time to me to choose a field, I was like, this thing my mom is talking about, I need to find out what's really going on from a legal point of view. Of course, I was very young and very naive. So I did think that we could do something from a legal point of view in terms of corruption, and not so much anymore. But yeah, so I did the PhD and I just kept, researching and writing in that area. So right now I am engaged in, I'll say, two complementary strands of research. So one is research on gender responsive procurement. So really the idea that businesses that are owned or led by women, should be able to participate fully in public sector supply chains. And there is an anti-corruption benefit to that, because generally when you diversify your public sector supply chains, when you diversify your procurement, there are multiplier effects, and one of that is mitigating corruption. And the other strand of research I'm doing actually came out from my work on gender responsive procurement, which is on gendered forms of corruption. So essentially, I did a large project a few years ago where I looked at gender responsive procurement in, I think, 7 African countries. And time again, when I speak to women entrepreneurs, one of their major complaints is like, I can't make any headway in procurement because I'm asked to perform a sexual act if I want to get a public contract. So I then began to look into, this issue of sexual corruption, because it's one of the barriers in procurement, and it's a corruption issue. So those are some of the things that I've been looking at, I think, for the past 3-4 years, almost exclusively. But I'm also interested, and I'd like to hear from the audience as well, in how we actually, of course, address the corruption issues, address the gendered corruption issues, but how do we actually really build the capacity of our contractors, especially SMEs and women-owned businesses, because they are always smaller. They don't find it as easy to navigate procurement, even without the corruption barriers. And so I've been thinking about how do we really, in practice, develop real relationships with our supply chain, especially with the smaller firms, with a long-term view, focusing on outcomes, which also, of course, will strengthen our supply chains. In the UK, especially in the commercial, in commerce or in business, we have what we call relational contracts, which are based on partnerships. There's a duty of trust. The integrity is an integral part of those contracts. And it's like, how can we, have more of those in the public sector, where we don't raise the specter of corruption all the time, but really develop our supply chain so that we can, improve outcomes, of course, improve gender equality when we're talking about women-owned businesses, and address corruption to an extent at the same time. So that's all from me.
Brilliant. So there's lots of important tensions there. And I think one is about facilitating learning and relationships and trust without all the downsides of too close relationships. And I should also point out, we've got another expert in the audience who I will pick on in a bit to answer some of these questions. Before I turn to Lloydette, I'm just going to say that Sope has co-edited a book that is on the stand outside, and we're going to hold a raffle at the end. In case it's two lucky people in this room will walk away with the Routledge Handbook of Public Procurement Corruption, which both Mishi and myself wrote a chapter in. Lloydette, what are your messages to the people in the room?
Okay, well, first of all, good evening, everybody. My thanks to you, Anna, and the team for the gracious invite to return to the school. It's really a pleasure to be here sitting amongst this esteemed panelists and experts. I can tell you now that I'm certainly not a procurement expert, and I wear a number of hats. So I'm a bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper in that I am a former Serious Fraud Office principal investigative lawyer. I spent about a decade in government working at the Crown Prosecution Service, HMRC, so Her Majesty's or His Majesty's Revenue and Customs Prosecution Office, and then latterly the Serious Fraud Office. And as Anna's already said, I now manage a corporate investigations and compliance consulting practice. So that hat is then also added on top of it is that I chair Spotlight on Corruption, which is a small but really influential, I say small but mighty advocacy charity. We really act as a critical friend to government in relation to all things anti-corruption, integrity, and we seek to try and influence policy in a cross-party manner. And we have ideas. We're not just a critical friend, but we actually have ideas, and we produce briefings and publications. And then my third hat that I wear is that I serve on several boards as a non-executive director. And so I will be I'll be approaching this discussion through the lens of my role as a practitioner, as well as through the other roles that I hold. My opening reflections on this topic center on a couple of areas. The first is this idea of mission-orientated public procurement, which is something that I read about in preparation for today's session. And it was an excellent paper by a lady called Mariana Mazzucato of LSE. And there are really no shortage of papers and ideas, and you'll all know this from the positions that you hold on public procurement, how it can work better when things have gone wrong. But I was particularly attracted to this concept of public procurement through the lens of mission-orientated approach. And I think because it takes public procurement beyond the criteria of just who is going to be the lowest or the highest bidder, who ticks the criteria in relation to cost, to being a strategic instrument of economic policy, seeking to address specific economic or social objectives. And so what are some of those economic or social objectives that public procurement might seek to address? One, Anna's already touched on in relation to innovation, another in relation to technology and development of new technologies. We're probably going to touch on this later, but in relation to environmental sustainability, how do you grow, for example, the SME sector? How do you grow successful companies? And things like, for example, health protection, better health outcomes for your population. And the idea of mission-orientated public procurement, or that approach, is really focused on, well, rather than think about what we want in terms of a product or a service, actually, why don't we think about this through the lens of what is the outcome that we're seeking to achieve? And I love the way that Ms. Mazzucato put it, which was, okay, so if our aim is to why don't we think about the outcome being something like, we want safer roads. So what we're looking for actually is for organizations and companies to develop technology around self-driving cars. The outcome actually is to have safer roads, so therefore we reduce, for example, fatalities on the road. And I think what this particular approach does create is this space for experimentation. It also presents us with hopefully the opportunity for public bodies to coordinate their public procurement, to really think about it in a much more holistic way rather than in a singular way. So that's mission orientation. I could go on lots and lots about it, but I won't. And we could touch on this a bit later. I think my second thought is really around my favourite hobby horse, which is all around enforcement. Well, it's no surprise because that's my area. But I think we can all think about when public procurement has gone spectacularly wrong, right? All of us in this room, I mean, the BBC today was referring to something of that nature. But the one in my mind is that I was born in Sierra Leone, but raised in the United Kingdom, is we have a road that is in the west of Freetown called Wilkinson Road. And this road has the infamy of being known as one of the most expensive roads in the world, right? In little Sierra Leone, in tiny little Freetown. So how did that happen? How did we actually spend tens and tens of millions of dollars on this maybe 3-mile road? And if you saw it, you'd be shocked, to be perfectly honest. It's nothing to write home about. So we have laws in place to guard against corruption, but these guardrails, the reality of it is that they don't actually work most of the time. When things go wrong, they don't work. So I think my other reflection is, what do we have to do now to ensure that we have the right mechanisms in place, that we fund the organizations that actually are tasked with investigating and prosecuting when things go wrong? And how do we create an environment where whistleblowers can report issues and be rewarded rather than retaliated against? So we look at, for example, the US and the False Claims Act and what they've been able to do there. My final reflection is more of a question, which is, what is the role of other stakeholders like civil society organizations, anti-corruption organizations that I've had the privilege to work with in different countries? I love the idea of Mexico's social watchers, who are, a group who are identified and able to sort of track what's happening in public procurement. So how do we bring a broad church of stakeholders to the public procurement process so that the best possible outcomes are achieved? Like I said, I'm not a specialist in this area, so I do have lots more questions than answers, but I wanted to pose those as sort of my reflections at this point.
You are a seasoned poacher, so you have plenty to add. From disaster cases to a systemic view, Mishi, why don't you explain a little bit about the great volume of work that you've done, which is really helping governments pinpoint the sectors, the regions, the stages of procurement that are problematic? And what insights do you want to leave the room with? What are the main headlines? Well, before people get too hot and tired, while we're still fresh, what would you say?
Thanks a lot, Anna. And I cannot summarize volumes of work my colleagues and a lot of others have done in 3 minutes. So really just cherry pick a few key messages. And I would like to thank everyone for sitting in the room. If I believe the French football team just started the game at a half an hour ago. So those of you who are with us, you are really interested in this topic. So that's a big thanks and a testimony. Just sharing actually the personal motivations for entering this research area, this policy area. So I'm Hungarian and from a small town in the middle of the country. And indeed, I started to do research on corruption in procurement, seeing, and we don't have the most extended road of the world, but, it's a tough competition. We're getting there. So, like first-hand experience with these things really gives you a motivation. And indeed, what I saw, and I must say, I'm not a lawyer, so I full respect for those of you who understand laws and regulations. I come from a very different perspective. I thought, let's try to use data which is out there. A lot of it is messy and structured in all sorts of weird ways, but useful information. And let's try to look across a large number of cases, kind of give us a different lens at looking at problems of corruption which are uncovered in individual cases, right? So that is where I'm coming from. But I don't just look at corruption, just like the previous panelist said. So I also look at other areas like collusion, so inter-bidder collusion of cartels in procurement, which often goes hand in hand with corruption. And I also like the idea of, well, all our anti-corruption efforts at the end of the day should lead to better procurement outcomes. Maybe lower prices, or timely, or higher quality, what have you, infrastructure or other procurement outcomes. Now, my key takeaways, first one is, and this is the first thing I noticed about procurement, and ever since I stick to it, public procurement is not a market, not at least at the most important aspect. It's not purely about buying and selling. You know, there's economic theories, and economists will tell you that's what matters: auction design, market structure. But it's far more than that, right? There are, of course, economic considerations, but there have been a lot of other strategic considerations: gender, innovation, sustainability. These naturally intervene, but also corruption. Government, high-level corruption mean that when governments buy something, it's not about buying the right thing at the right price, value for money. It's about, say, rewarding someone who gave me a political party donation. It's about a payback, right? There's an economic calculus there, but it's not a market calculus we like, but a very different corrupt or favoritistic calculus. Defense procurement has been mentioned. This is the area where the market-based logic over and over again fails us. A lot of governments own defense suppliers. You can think about Italian and French government. I mean, the government is buying from itself partially, right? I mean, this is not kind of public buying from private, or, you know, the government drawing on the innovative force of private sector actors. Much more a collaboration, a guidance, much more long-term view on you know, national security issues and considerations. So just to nail down a few solutions coming from this very political economy understanding of what's happening in procurement, I think a lot of the times the real solution in procurement don't lie directly in procurement regulation. Okay, so first thing is actors matter a lot. So those who do procurement from the public side, the procurement officials, the procurement specialists, the civil servants, whether they are loyal to their political leaders or bosses, or they're independent from them, is a major effect on corruption and major effect on a simple question. I got elected as a mayor. These guys bankrolled my electoral campaign, give them a big contract and allow them to overprice. Well, you are independent bureaucrat, cannot be fired, and you say, sorry, there are these rules, there are these goals, I will stick to a proper procedure. I cannot just award a contract to your crony. But if the bureaucrat is appointed by the politician and they can be fired at will without justification, which is the case in a lot of countries, well, that request will be simply followed. And then you can write the beautiful procurement rules, the implementation will be very different. So focusing on who are the people doing buying, whether they're independent, whether they have the right capacity, whether they have the right resources, is crucial, right? And you can write the beautiful rules on paper, de facto something else will happen if you don't get this right. I think party finance have been mentioned as well. I think more broadly, political competition, party finance, lobbying regulations have enormous impact on procurement outcomes, simply because, again, procurement is not simply a marketplace. It's a way to pay back those companies who supported electoral campaign or, you know, gave favors in other ways. So sort of, interestingly enough, changing rules for electoral competition, and this is a paper we had for the UK, as one of the biggest opportunities for cost savings in procurement. The UK is full of safe seats, right? Which are always, or maybe this election this will not be the case, but, you know, historically have been uncontested in a sense that it's always the same party leading. So if you have such an electoral situation, then the motivations for high quality public spending, so on and so forth, fighting corruption, are way lower, right? There's a lot of literature on this. So you look at sort of electoral reform, which Scotland did, for example, for local elections. Their effect on procurement outcomes is spectacular. And you wouldn't expect this, right? But if you reconstitute, you kind of reinterpret procurement as a payback for political favors, they suddenly realize, okay, I shouldn't think about thresholds or, you know, review bodies in procurement. I should think about the motivations of the key actors and fix those first. I'm not saying these are the only solutions, but these are the surprising success stories which have a major impact in procurement, but you wouldn't expect them at first. I will stop here. I overrun my 3 minutes, but I'm really excited to discuss further corruption in procurement.
Wonderful. So thank you, Mihaly. lots of ideas on the table. And on Mishy's last point, pre-car wash scandal in Brazil, the return on investment for campaign financing was about 14 times. So it was an excellent proposition in terms of the procurement contracts that you would get back and the profit you would make on them. Okay, well, many topics on the table, from how do you deal with individual disaster cases, how do you deal with the tension between the need to create learning and bring in lower capacity, smaller businesses, with the risks of really close relationships in procurement. And Mihaly pointed to the system level propositions that we should really be engaging with as well. So let's start with some drama. Does anyone want to share a disaster that has motivated them to be here today? I was personally motivated because I was a journalist for 10 years and I was reporting on corruption all the time in procurement, and I realized it was how the system ran. I was stationed in Argentina, and the president and her husband would have these false names friends who would be the names that won all of the public procurement contracts. Anyway, I find myself here as a result. Does anyone want to share a disaster story, a motivating moment to be here to do with procurement? There's no disasters. What a surprise. I thought procurement was full of disasters.
I don't know if this rises to the level of disaster, but I really appreciate your expertise. My name is Lucy Lang, and I serve as the New York State Inspector General and have jurisdiction over the state executive agencies and authorities. And in New York, and I will beg your forgiveness that I don't know what the international landscape looks like on this, we have what's known as the Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprises requirement that all state contracts have 30% delivered by minority or women-owned businesses. And something that we find over and over again is that that these businesses are being used as pass-throughs. And we have a difficulty with prosecutions and enforcement, in part because, as you say, Anna, the system sort of runs this way, and the big contractors are happy with it because they're doing what they do. The minority and women-owned businesses are happy with it because they're getting business they wouldn't otherwise get. And it seems that the agencies are happy with it because they're meeting their threshold. So my question is twofold: what do you make of this sort of strategic approach that the state has taken? And secondarily, do you have prescriptions for how you would enforce or handle this sort of misalignment of the intent of the program and its application?
Would you like to take this one?
Yeah. Okay, so maybe in terms of the strategic approach, it's very common, and actually it was the US government that was that started, having preferences for, women especially at the federal level. So I'm not so familiar with how it works in the states, in the states. So that's common, and we do have a problem with, I think, two big problems that we have. One is actually a misalignment in the sectors in which women businesses operate, and the sectors in which there are procurement opportunities. So that's a big problem because women-owned businesses are generally smaller. They are in retail, in hospitality, in cleaning, things like that. But in African context, procurement is construction, energy, stormwater, right? So
one woman in a garage is purportedly delivering tons and tons of steel.
And so the second problem, and because of that, the second problem we have is this: in Africa we call it fronting, where a woman is purportedly the owner of the business, but it's usually someone else. And there are different mechanisms to deal with it. One of them is really having robust certification to know that this business is a business that is owned, managed, led by a minority, depending on what your definitions are. The other thing that's being done, which is kind of basic, but it works in a way, is in Kenya, what they said is that if a business is owned by a woman, then the bank account must be in a woman's name. So of course, that doesn't eliminate all the problems, but at least on some level, you say, well, whatever she does with the money after but in terms of who's the beneficiary of those finances, it has to be. But of course, that only works for smaller businesses and not for, bigger enterprises. So it's a common problem and different ways of addressing it. But from work that I've done, there isn't one way of fixing it because, people are, exploiting all the loopholes that they can get.
And it's not just in gender, it's the fronting also happens for other...
So in South Africa, we have a policy of Black economic empowerment, and it's the same thing. Companies that apparently are run by Black people, but are not. So it's in every sector where you have a preference or some kind of prioritization for a minority group or a disadvantaged group, you will have this. So maybe Lloydette knows how to enforce these. I don't know.
I think it is a difficult one to think about when it comes to enforcement, because ultimately, what are you seeking to do? What is the aim of the enforcement, strategy? I think part of it is, first of all, that the policy was set up in order to empower and to bring minoritized communities into the frame. Oftentimes they're not involved in IT contracting or technology or defense. But I think it's about whether or not where you can identify if that individual has been exploited. If there is an exploitation element to it, then I think that's where strategically you would want to go after the individual who is, behind the company. If, for example, that woman, obviously, it still defeats the aim if the individual is participating and they go into it with their eyes open and there's a deal done. But if there is an element of exploitation, then I think that's the type of case that you would want to take and to pursue through the courts. Because what that will do is it will achieve two things. Number one, it will bring to the forefront this issue of fronting as it is, or having, but also I think it will open a debate about how do we actually get these minoritized communities, empower them, not only just to be able to, but to be able to bid for these contracts. What do we need to do in terms of our framework so that they are interested in? So if we look at it from the base level, we see a lot of women don't go into STEM subjects. They don't study STEM subjects. So there's lots of layers to this. So you can't seek just enforcement as the only tool, but hopefully by pursuing a case where you do use it, I would hope that you would also have a wider conversation about what this policy is seeking to serve and how it could do that better. And then think about what other things you could do at a state level to make that actually work for the communities that it's targeted at.
Can you say something?
Yes, I just want to go to Mihaly online before we do that, because he's got his hand up and he's being very polite. And also because when I wrote the chapter for you, Mihaly's work was once again really the only data crunching on this topic. And I don't know if this is what you're going to say, Mihaly, but you really make the case for having these kind of gender responsive policies. Do come in and say what you're going to say. And if you want to say a little bit about that analysis, that would be great.
I'm super happy to continue this conversation, because I agree that using enforcement tools in this field might not get you the right results. And one of the effects of more enforcement would be more sophisticated avoidance of the various rules, or a circumvention of various rules. So what I wanted to say is that based on our literature review on what works in this domain, I think indeed the successful special treatment policies, it can be SME, it can be women-owned business, it can be various minority groups, have been those which expanded the pool of bidders rather than restricting it, right? So you give this special treatment, extra points, or whatever set aside, because you want actors, can be self-employed, small companies, what have you, to enter procurement which wouldn't have entered otherwise, right? So in that sense, what you're doing, you are targeting your procurement activities for developing the market. And if you see it's not working, it's not necessarily because the policy is wrong, but because the underlying market might not be there. And this is our research, which we did in Europe, is that your outcomes in procurement and gender balance among the suppliers heavily depends on gender balance in the corresponding sector. So if there are no women in the construction sector, to start with, right? But you set aside construction sector contracts, no matter how good your rules are, what will happen is that people will find ways to, well, actually get those contracts and have some women fronting companies. So what you need to do is develop the market, which is coupling your procurement policy with specific trainings and workshops and information sessions to help businesses enter this market. And if that's not enough, you have to target these women who are interested in construction and believe there are women interested in construction, then set those companies up, help them grow, help them credit, right? So kind of you have to go one step deeper into the market, and it depends on the different countries' approach. Definitely there's a big culture of this in Europe, probably less in the US, but the government creating the market conditions for delivery. I think that's the next logical step. Enforcement is important, but it's not going to solve the underlying problem that we need these companies who can compete and want to be there, right? And then if they're not there, we have to help them create those. It might take years, right? It might take years, but it's worth the investment.
Invite Sope to comment, but I would love to hear from you guys what works on the ground to bring in and get bidders from smaller companies, right? And to include groups that tend not to win procurement contracts because they go to the big companies, right? And these big companies tend to be multinational, and they tend to be very often, and Mishy's stats show this, mostly white and male. So just before I turn to Sope, I wanted to pick up on the points that you mentioned. So you mentioned points rather than women-owned. And we're seeing procurement rules in many countries become gender responsive rather than dictating sort of this percentage of the stock or this number of managers or whatever it is be women. Gender responsive is really advantaging companies for having particular parental rights or having gender equal pay. So it's going beyond, if you like, women as sex and thinking about the structural reasons why you get the underrepresentation. Sope, you've been very patient.
No, I think just a comment to talking about maybe the fronting issue that is kind of newish, but is this idea of beneficial ownership and linking that to procurement. So we've had beneficial ownership to deal with, money laundering and issues like that. But recently we're seeing trying to match those registries to procurement so that you really have an idea of who the real, beneficial owner of the companies are. So Kenya has done that. Where you have to, your beneficial ownership has to be matched with your procurement database. And that's one way of trying to find out, if the people that you want award contracts are the real beneficial owners of that contract. So that's sort of something that's coming up. I mean, beneficial ownership has its own issues like anything else, but that's one way that we're trying to address that problem. Yeah.
Brilliant. Please introduce yourself and tell us what works.
I'm Irene Batebe from Uganda. I'm the permanent secretary in our Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development. And listening into the conversation, I find it very interesting because we've been very deliberate in supporting not just women, but also small-scale entrepreneurs, and the model kind of relates to the support for women. So what we do in order to support them better is break down our procurements into lots so that it's not one big tender that requires quite some level of financial capacity. So we will lot it, and that way you have the smaller companies coming in, and therefore more women-led companies tendering and accessing some of these bids. That's one way. Then the other way, what we've also done is through our stakeholder engagement and sensitization, we've encouraged joint venture partnerships where we encourage the women-led entrepreneurial groups to venture and partner with those that are probably doing better. So they could be better in terms of the technical capacity in terms of bid responsiveness or financial. So that way you're able to form a joint venture bid and have the women in there, and that way they grow their capacity and later on they're able to do it on their own. We've also gone a bit extreme to do what we call ring fencing. So for some areas, we've ring-fenced a few where we think would have more women-led companies or firms participate, areas of catering, certain works, the softer ones, to get them in, crowd them in, let them grow their capacity and move to the bigger things. So those are some of the areas, specific, targeted, deliberate areas we've addressed. Thank you.
Fantastic. And by ring fence, you mean reserving?
Reserving.
Basically.
Yes, reserving. Yes.
That might not be legal in every country. I'm curious to know how others react to that. We have another hand up. Rose, tell us what works. Yeah.
Yes, and Kenya, you mentioned Kenya. Actually, for us, Kenya reserves by law 30% of procurement through women and youth. So whether you are bound by law to ensure that the implementation may be a bit tricky, but it is working for women and and to support them. There for women and youth, there's also a fund that you can get some loan and be able to start small procurement, to do small procurements. To a large extent, we've seen women really coming up very well. There's also this table banking, they're doing the chama. A chama is
a circle.
Or a circle.
Yeah, no way.
Yeah, a circle. They get together in the various places, and you find that women are now getting together and growing. Like if there's an area for bananas, they grow the banana. They lease even a quarter of an acre of land, and then they grow bananas and actually sell them, supply them to the market. And as a result, women have really come up. And they're bringing up their families, even where really there was in the rural areas where there was really no hope. You can see that this woman has come up, she's taking her children to school and she's feeding the children in that. So we've seen that working quite well, but that doesn't mean it's all running very smoothly. There's a lot of hidden things there. If you are to follow, it's not always easy to get to get these contracts. And on the other extreme of, so we've seen, it is actually in the bigger contracts that we've seen fronting. You find a woman, she's doing business, very big business. She's even selling drugs, she's selling medical equipment and all that. For those, that is where fronting is happening. A lot of it. It is not in the smaller ones a lot, and there really also there is corruption because so there's a bit of that, and a lot of it, because then you find the same people getting the same contracts, or you find a certain people and the people behind them dominating certain sectors of the economy, and to the extent that sometimes there is what we are calling budgeting corruption into the system, so that yes, you influence it here, and then you just wait quietly and wait for it on the other side and do the business. That happens. This is Chatham House.
Chatham House, I should point out it's also YouTube.
Yes, but it is those are the realities. It's working, but then there are also challenges on this other side. Yeah.
But the potential multipliers of it working when it works are very important. So we have another hand up. I'll turn to you in a minute, Mishi. Sarah, go for it.
Hello, I'm Sarah. I'm from Brazil, and I'm bringing an example when I work at the education department. In my state, I work for the state level, not for the federal. And I could not do what was suggested in Brazil of buying the same product and splitting it in several contracts because it would be illegal. But what is happening in the education department is that they are starting to decentralize the process of buying some items. It's not possible to do it with everything, but we can do it with some kind of products like perishable ones. And then when these products usually are bought in the community and usually from smaller business. And there is also another program that was made with an intention and had another effect. That was a program of putting money in the schools for the students to decide how to spend. And they had the primary goal was to engage students in the school management. But then what happened is also that part of the money, this money that went to the students to decide, usually was spent in the community and in a smaller business. So it was like a side effect of the primary policy. And I think that maybe a way of having more inclusion is for the governments to believe that the local, not only the local in terms of municipality, but the school or the hospital, that they can make some decisions to buy some products. And then probably you're going to have more diversity on these decisions and also more inclusion of different products, local products that are more connected to the realities and all of it. So that's it.
Fantastic. There is a growing literature on seeing different groups, not, if you like, as owners of businesses, but as taxpayers and citizens within procurement, and bringing them into earlier stages with transparency, if you like, at the start and the middle stages of procurement, rather than just as accountability. Mm-hmm. Chris has his hand up, but I'm going to go to Mihaly, because Mihaly is the person who knows all about transparency and procurement in the data. Tell us a little bit about the different forms of transparency and how they play out for different outcomes. Big question.
I'm allowed to react just very quickly to these great comments because I love them. Just give me a sec. So I think what many of you pointed at is that often an indirect way of supporting specific target groups like women-owned business or what have you is more effective. So instead of focusing on a set aside or giving them extra points, need to understand what blocks these groups from bidding, right? The important contract size, lot size standards. And I think this is super powerful. And I just want to react on the previous comment. So not saying slice the tenders up so that it goes under whatever threshold. You can keep the tender large, but divide it into lots, right? So the rules still apply. You're not breaking the law, but you allow companies to bid on individual lots. So I think that's the standard solution. But there are also questions around administrative burden. Maybe small companies don't have the people who can fill this complicated paperwork. So you don't need, again, set asides. You just need to help SMEs to do the paperwork. Maybe targeted training or just simplify procedures. And here you go. You get a lot more SMEs or women-owned enterprises bidding. Timing is a big thing. Procuring at the right time. Giving some companies more time or less time. You need to understand the specific constraints for your target group. So I just wanted to pull this out because many of the comments were really spot on. And I think there is a lot of and a growing literature on this, how to target specific groups through basically better tender design, because that's what it is. You design tenders to fit the market, to fit the companies you want to be. So sorry for this long kind of non-answer, but I get to your point about transparency. So I think for a long time in anti-corruption, transparency meant freedom of information. So if someone asks for information, you can submit a request and you get at one point a response. Now in the domain of procurement and in a lot of other areas, we moved past that, long past that. And basically what we do is active transparency. So data should be readily and automatically available, right? So if you buy something as a government, you want a situation where the relevant information is available right away, automatically, free of charge to all the relevant actors. And I think this also points at the sort of second big trends or development and trend in the literature and also reforms is that transparency in general is interesting, we like it, but it doesn't really lead to results. What is actually important is the right kind of information at the right time, get to the right actors. Okay, so if you want bidders to watch each other, right, horizontal accountability, what is very important is the budgeting and the tendering information, calls for tenders to be published in high quality, easily accessible. So basically, you have to understand whom you want to hold whom to account. If you want the corrupt bidder to be watched by the non-corrupt potential or actual bidders, well, you need to get the information to these groups and get them in a credible way, that they think, okay, it makes sense for me to monitor these others because there will be some effect. So sort of providing information and using that information is very closely interlinked. So just by publishing some information, you're not going to get much result. So I think these reforms have been very powerful, and when they were gotten right, then they really produce the results you want. And I also want to say that the third point is that the cost of doing this is dramatically decreased. Like with open source software from procurement to various dashboards, various targeted information like newsletters, and that this is like dramatically went down. So basically, if a government or an agency wants to get more bidders to increase integrity, then the tools are really there, and we don't need to think about how to do it. It's really the question of, do we really want to do it? And that, of course, gets back to the political economy question: who is funding whom, whose party campaign, so on and so forth.
Thank you. So yeah, transparency can be a powerful tool, but it's not one thing. You can have many different forms of transparency. And procurement it requires a lot of specialism, right? So it makes sense what Michi's saying, that the peers know what to look for. The citizens generally don't really. And when you rely on this vertical accountability, citizen accountability plays through so many different prisms of biases of how we see the world. And this is particularly relevant to the question of gender. It's generally understood within scholarship on gender and corruption that men and women by nature are not more or less corrupt. There's a fantastic experiment which makes the point. It was run in Burkina Faso and in Canada. And in both places, people were told, just, you're going to be paid to mark these exam papers. It's really easy. There's a marking guide, just work through it. And halfway through, there's some money, a $20 bill. Like, don't find many mistakes in this particular paper. In both countries, when they're told no one's checking, the same proportion of men and women take the bribe. But the moment you say that there's going to be accountability, there'll be random auditing, in both countries, women start taking the bribe less. And so what's going on here is there's a general expectation from religious texts, bedtime stories, whatever, Cinderella, that women are supposed to be purer. And this leads to greater punishment and the expectation of greater punishment by women when it comes to taking these kind of ethical transgression risks in other people's eyes. Yeah. There were quite a few people looking at me. I'm very tempted, if she doesn't mind, to acknowledge Elle Carter, who's in the room. You look a little shocked. Elle is the academic director of the Government Outcomes Lab. And you have a lot to say about learning and relational contracting. And I'm just wondering if you could offer a few takeaways for the room from what your lab does.
Try. This has been such a fantastic conversation. I wonder actually if I might try and draw some connections between what you were saying, Lloydette, and what you were sharing, Sope. So at the Government Outcomes Lab, we've done a lot of research around outcomes-based contracting, or particularly where a social outcome measure has been embedded in a complex public-private partnership or a public not-for-profit partnership. And I think in some ways this connects to what Lloydette was talking about in terms of this kind of mission-oriented public procurement, where instead of buying a service, we think much more about what's the outcome that we are seeking, and instead embedding that in the arrangements. So in some ways, these look like very formal accountability structures because we have a very strong measurement around these outcomes, reporting more publicly in some situations against these measures. But I'm struck by the fact that as well as looking very formal, they might be the space for much more adaptation. And when we've walked alongside these projects and supported some research, what we found is that these are not always kind of the punitive sticks of targets to hit teams with, but there's a much more adaptive and lively conversation between the purchasers and the providers where unforeseen challenges occur to navigate that. But that feels to me like a very precarious space. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more, Sope, about relational contracts without raising the spectre of corruption. And for those in the EPLP group, there was part of the pre-reading, this is seeding for next week, a great paper in Harvard Business Review that talks about formal relational contracting, or where we might be able to use some of the formal contracting as a scaffold to more relational practice. So that seems to me very precarious space. So I just wondered whether you wanted to offer any reflections on navigating this.
So I think we talk about relational contracts as usually long-term contracts where there's a significant amount of commitment between the parties. If you look at it as public sector, private sector, then, and especially if you look at it from the lens of smaller businesses, then there's a lot of investment in terms of time, in terms of capacity building for these businesses. So you think in business to business, you have this already, a lot of contracts, a lot of companies, supply chains are long-term partnerships. They have these relationships and to a large degree they work. But I think that in the public sector, because we are always looking at things from that prism, is this relationship, dodgy? Is there going to be problems with the relationship? We don't build those relationships. And I mean, I find like, especially in Africa, relationships in public sector, private sector are very adversarial. They're only relational in that sense when they are corrupted. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that you can have those relationships where you use those relationships to develop your supply chain and to get better outcomes. Because of course, the market is more sophisticated than usually the public sector, not always, but usually, and they have a better approach to innovation or to getting the outcomes that you want. But because we're very very adversarial, very strict, procurement is rule bound here, but in South Africa, it's incredible. It's very, very adversarial, very, very unpleasant even for bidders, especially if you don't have an existing corrupted relationship with the public sector. So the idea is really to first build the capacity of the public sector to understand that there are ways of engaging with the private sector. But that also means that you have to take a step back and ensure that your public sector is competent and ethical to a degree to be able to do that. And I think that takes us back to recruitment practices, which we don't really talk about in conversations about procurement. But I always talk to my students about, look at what the private sector does when they want to recruit, because they're looking for the right fit. But we don't do that much of looking for the right fit, looking for the right person at least in the African context. A lot of it is not always merit-based in the way that it should be. So taking that out of the equation is how do you build a public sector that can relate appropriately to your smaller business, your women-led businesses that can do the type of investment in building the capacity of those organizations, so that those relationships are developed and that they can be partnerships. Because I think we're talking about, we were talking about this. There was a procurement conference in Nottingham last week, and we were talking about that procurement is changing. We've moved away from, value for money to values-based procurement to outcomes-based procurement. But if you do that using the same skills set that you've had for value for money, lowest price, you're not going to get the outcomes that you want. So I think we really need to think about, okay, what do we need to do in terms of our capacity, just on the public sector side and the private sector side, in order to move with this procurement that is changing with the times. At the event we had this morning, the focus was on net zero procurement. So many cities have net zero targets. Is your procurement workforce capacitated to deliver net zero targets? So you can't be having this at different, places in the atmosphere, and the people on the ground are like, what is even net zero, right? So we need to think about the value chain of procurement, the environment of procurement, to ensure that we can do what it is that we want to do in terms of, outcomes and inclusivity and diversity and even, corruption mitigation.
Thank you. And I'm going to push you a little bit, because there's got to be an inherent tension there. I mean, you referenced hiring people, looking for the right fit as what we should be aiming for. But I'm sure that many of us have been in situations where we've seen a hiring committee and it's sort of understood who's probably going to get the job, but everybody's going through the behaviors and the processes of advertising it widely. And that's not to say that the system isn't open to a better fit, but that the system was somewhat designed with the imagined best fit already in mind. So how do you create authenticity along with this kind of coaching? And I'm going to turn to a poacher in a minute to see what people on the kind of the telling people off for doing the wrong thing make of these arguments, and if it's come up at all. But before I do, I just want to turn to Mihaly, because I wonder how trends in putting everything online, e-procurement, fits with these kinds of conversations about building capacity and slow and sustained relationships, rather than this kind of transactional blind approach that e-procurement brings to mind.
Thank you, Anna, for this super difficult question. So I see that there is a shortcut to focus on just price because it's easy to measure, and because we have a lot of data, we measure what we can. So I feel that a lot of these nuanced discussions we have can be lost in data-driven discussions. I think there's a real risk there. And also when Sope says that, well, procurement moved on to this value-based, outcomes-based, I mean, that's not what the data is telling me. It's still like overwhelming majority in nearly all the countries I see is just price-based selection and very narrowly defined technical purchases, which, maybe it will change, but I don't see that at all in the data. So I think e-procurement has the capacity to show us aspects of procurement which are well measurable. But a lot of the things we talk about here in terms of, net zero, I mean, it's not in these data sets. Even in individual cases would be so hard to measure, right? What we are up with is, prices, maybe quantities, timeliness, and this is still what dominates the discussion. And I don't think it's altogether wrong, right? It's just, I find it hard to use the data language, which has developed a lot, and make sure that we can apply this language to these new requirements. Just, green, sustainable procurement. I mean, just identifying these contracts which are relevant for our sustainability goals, that's not there. I mean, it's as basic as that. It's super hard to nail it down because it's very complex, it's very qualitative, it's a lot of context dependent. A lot is hidden behind the procurement contracts because it depends on the suppliers, the subcontractors, and then two, three, 4 layers of subcontracting in the full supply chain. So what I'm saying here is that I think the reality moves far slower than what we would want it to move. And data is still very heavily focused on the classical goals. So if we take these points seriously, the green, the net zero, we need to change the e-procurement system. It doesn't work without that.
Thank you. But I bet well, I know some of the tools exist to do things slightly differently, right? It's just whether they're spread out enough in government for people to use them. So you could imagine using some of the tools researchers use in this department to analyze text. You could analyze the bids for certain features around net zero, around aspirations, around mission-driven procurement. You could decide what your best fit is and bring in some kind of weighting for it.
I mean, look, so I think if you honestly look at how procurement is done in most countries I have seen, is that basically it's extremely compliance oriented. Yeah. It's extremely risk averse, right? This is how people get selected into this, right? To start with, a lot of countries, procurement as a profession is not a way to get to a leadership position. So basically a lot of very ambitious people just avoid procurement to start with. So I think it's part of the people. The story is about the people who are doing this and whether they are ready. And Sope mentioned this. Do they know what is net zero? Do they know what they need to write in those tender specifications to get the green contracts they want to get, right? I think it is really a mindset change, and it's very hard when there is so much talk about corruption, compliance, and fraud. Because then what will these people go for, right? Those who actually implement procurement tenders. Well, they go for the safe option, right? And it's very hard to change this mindset. And the same goes for innovation procurement. A lot of people about it, but most of it is not working. Simply because who wants to take risks? Who is the procurement official, the thousands of procurement officials in small villages who don't go for the safe option, spending my budget because no one wants to give money back to the treasury, right? Versus doing something risky and innovative.
Okay, thank you. Now, as it happens, there was actually upstairs an event on procurement and net zero today, which I learned about halfway through the day. And I know that more than one person in this room was there. So I invite you to have a little reflection on what would be worth sharing with the room in a second. But Lloydette, what do people who are involved in prosecuting wrongdoers and uncovering them make of these arguments about learning and building trust and long-term relationships? Does that feature in the discussions? It's interesting if it doesn't.
It really doesn't, to be honest with you. It doesn't, but I think part of it is really, first of all, when you look at an issue that has occurred, at my time working at the Serious Fraud Office, and I think the statistics will bear this out even now for the Department of Justice and all the other sort of regulatory bodies like it, is that when you're talking about a serious economic crime and specifically corruption and fraud, often public procurement is right at the heart of it. It's someone who paid a bribe to win a contract, a significant bribe to win a contract. And not oftentimes it's a public contract. And I think from us, the way that, for me anyway, one of the things that I look at often is just, first of all, who are the people that are involved in this from the perspective of, do they actually have the skills that they're supposed to have to be in a position to mitigate the situation from happening? And I think it speaks to this issue about capacity building. So often in organizations, what you have are people who are there not based on technical skill and ability, but based on some other non-merit-based preference. And that is often the breeding ground for issues to occur, for those individuals to take a payment that they ought not to take, to close their eyes to an issue that they ought not to close their eyes to. And I think much more than that, when I'm looking at it in terms of, okay, as a former prosecutor, one of the things that I'm also going to be considering are things like, what is the work that has been done to understand what went wrong here? Because I think so often that it feels like there's almost a culture of impunity around procurement fraud or massive issues that occur. And it's sort of, well, oh, you know, there's a shrug of the shoulders. Oh, well, you know, bad decisions were made. Contracts were handed out to the wrong people. Well, it's done now. What can we do? And so much of the time, I don't think the lessons are really being learned and the work is being done to understand how did this actually happen and what went wrong and what are we going to do differently now? So for me, it doesn't really figure in my considerations. But if I think about my role now as a corporate investigator advising companies and institutions on these issues, one of the key things that I do say is that you need to understand that if you are eventually investigated and prosecuted, one of the major issues will be around debarment. You will be excluded from public contracts. And therefore, what do you as the board want to do about this? How do you want to navigate this? Do you want to cooperate with the SFO or the DOJ or whoever it may be and try and get yourself into a position where you can bring this to a close much sooner? Or do you want to take an adversarial position on this issue and fight it all the way? Because there will be consequences either way. But I think the reality is that organizations have to see that risk of debarment as a very real risk in order to sort of dissuade some of the bad behavior that we have seen that goes unpunished. They have to know that, you know, because ultimately these corporates are here to make money. Okay, this is a commercial relationship. And often I think sometimes also, because I've had a very similar discussion today in one of my boards, we have to recognize in the public sector that the people that we're dealing with are not necessarily in partnership with us always, but they're there because they are a commercial beast. And so what they are focused on is the commercials. The rest of it is really neither here or there for a lot of companies. You might have tick some ethical boxes, but ultimately it's all about profit. And I think when you look at it through that lens, then you have to approach it in a particular way. But just to kind of close that off, is just really around understanding that the risk of debarment and the risk of exclusion is a very real one. And in so many jurisdictions, that risk never materializes. And so companies know that. They know that they can get away with it. And so therefore, some of the bad practices that we see over and over again, they simply just continue.
Powerful stuff. So I'm going to continue in similarly powerful language as I make a connection. So to some of my students, they would definitely say that the non-realization of net zero is what you call a culture of impunity, right, of this generation. And I'm curious, for those who are in the climate discussions, whether debarment for not realizing, for not making good on your net zero commitments was even came up in the conversation? No? But what were the takeaways from that session on net zero of Missy saying that people writing the specifications for procurement don't really know what they're looking for in terms of net zero? What should you tell them?
Okay, actually, we talked today about how do you design procurement to move to a net zero world. And there are huge challenges in designing procurement because it's about requirements, it's about having capacity in public side, it's about having what you want in the contract is specific. It's about designing what are the outcomes of the contract. So the issues are so huge. And we do not still have what we understand about green procurement. Under this umbrella, everything can happen. And there's we didn't get at the point that if we have a government contract and the contractor doesn't end up bringing what was contracted, if it was the case of the farmers. No, we didn't got to this point, and unfortunately, I think our challenges were much more at the designing of the idea instead of talking about the end.
Chris.
I was wondering if you could connect that response and this ambition around net zero to what Ivan was talking about about lots. Because well, at least in my experience with public procurement, one of the biggest mistake I've seen, I think, over 40 years of procurement reform is trying to reform the system as a whole. Because the system as a whole is moving 13 trillion US dollars a year. In South Africa right now, there's a huge debate following a long period of corruption and a judicial commission on state capture, which recommended a huge reset of procurement in the whole country. And the evidence, the argument for it is, well, 80 to 90% of the corruption we saw was procurement based. But no one ever talks about, well, what percent of the procurement was corrupt, which could be 3%, right? Just the fact that 90% of the corruption is in procurement doesn't tell you you need to fix all the procurement in the country. What will happen is new rules will get put into effect for all procurement. Mostly it'll just slow up a lot of procurement that people need. And the corruption will probably actually just find a way around the bits of the piece that was. So and it's layer after layer of that, whether it's minority contracting, net zero, whatever you're anti-corruption, whatever you're trying to do. When you try and fix the system as a whole with that, what mostly you do is just slow up the system as a whole, drive even more people out of the public sector procurement because they just want to get on with it and just try and find some private sector companies that will buy their goods. But if you can do it in lots, if you can say, here's a lot of work we want in the public sector. And we want to use this to figure out how we can build contracts with net zero requirements in it, or with minority contractor, or with contractor. You can, if you can disaggregate the system and work on the different various public goals you want at a lot level, you can learn a lot about how you achieve your goal. You can actually achieve more of those goals, and probably produce it. Our challenge in the public sector is we have so many missions. Mission-related procurement is what we do, but we're on so many missions simultaneously, including just helping the minister get their program through before they finish their term. I remember a minister in one Latin American country coming into the very beginning of their term, very sophisticated about how government worked, and just said the most important thing in their first weeks in office was to get a series of procurements going, because they knew unless they did it right away, 4 years later, they wouldn't have been able to say they delivered on anything. And they needed exceptions to all the procurement rules. Not only did they need 4 years, but they need 4 years and lots of exceptions. And they weren't trying to steal the money. They were just trying to deliver on what people had elected them to do. So I think avoiding each new mission bogging down the whole procurement system. I think Irene's notion of thinking about your different goals, identifying a group of contracts and procurement that you can use that are well suited to that, and then experimenting with how do you write those contracts and that procurement to your goal. And I just want to get the two of you together.
So a kind of learning for the people thinking about how to do procurements, as opposed to the companies you're trying to bring into procurement. Yeah. We are 5 minutes until the end of this session. We have a very important business of a raffle, but I did want to invite any last points, reflections from the panelists or those of you listening in the room. In which case, I might ask for a final comment from Sope, who really kind of brought this together by inviting me and Amishi to join her in her project. What would you say to people who are trying to do the first things to build capacity for procurement? What are the one or two things that you want people to think about?
So I'll say if it's about building capacity, first know what you have and what you actually need, and then work on bridging that gap. In some of the work that I've done, I found that when people talk about building capacity, they just have an idea, okay, if we get this training, it'll be fixed, but we don't know what the real capacity gap is. So actually do some kind of needs analysis or gap analysis, and then, okay, these are the skills we need. This is what we have, and what can we do to bridge that gap? And what I found, especially many African countries, there's challenges with capacity, but you also have so many islands of excellence of capacity. But because we do everything in silos, you have that these people are not speaking to bigger groups and sharing that learning. But it's so developing a culture of actually knowing where we are and what we need, and then developing a culture of really sharing experiences across the public sector. That I find is almost never done. So creating the space for that, I would say do that.
Excellent takeaways. Thank you, Sope Williams. Thank you, Lloydette. Thank you, Mihaly. And a big thank you to all of you in the room. And a special thank you to Leah, who did all the organisation behind the scenes. And Leah is going to be the master of the raffle. We have the only hat that Leah and I could find among ourselves, which isn't the most, I guess it does have transparency risks in the wrong kind of way. Leah, would you like to do the honours?
Yes, I would love to. And I just wanted to add the thanks there and making up. For those who don't know me, my name is Leah and I'm the engagement manager of the Women Foundation program, to which Anna is our director. And I want to just extend our thanks to the whole EPLP and his ed team. And Chris Behav is here with us, that has allowed us to add this event to your already very full and very packed schedule. So I really appreciate you all being here with us, because it has definitely enriched the conversation. So thank you. I know it's been intense week, intense day, but thank you for being here. And well, let's see who the lucky one is.
I've heard Mihaly doesn't have a number.
They won't be able to. And I won't peek, I promise, for transparency and accountability. Number 6. 6. It is written here. And
there's a second one.
Yes. Number 7.
Oh gosh.
Totally random.
We're together.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much.
And is there any Purcell?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the conversation. I hope to see you in our next events.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.